I'm standing on a sidewalk on Mishawaka Avenue in the year 2024, just across the street from Adams High School, and I am looking at a parking garage, trying to imagine the building that used to stand in this same place. I've seen the artists' renditions of the old building that used to be here, built to fanfare across South Bend in 1903. Those renditions were reproduced on letterhead and envelopes and postcards, sent off to be printed in newspapers across the Rust Belt. They showed a beautiful campus that housed production and business activities for several hundred employees, a red building with a stunning view of the St. Joseph River, buttressed by a pair of idyllic sputtering fountains, nestled comfortably beneath a perfect sky in a symphony of blue. That building isn't here anymore. Of course, that building was never here. It was a common trick of the time to hire artists to sketch an idealized version of a company's headquarters. It spelled success to would-be customers and sold a more perfect workplace to potential employees. As companies sought to entice experienced watchmakers from the eastern United States, its marketing materials became a key ingredient in the seduction. Hirings were conducted mostly remotely, often by a weeks-long exchange of letters. By the time a new employee arrived in South Bend to survey his new workplace, there was no turning back. He'd already quit his job, sold his flat, and loaded up his possessions for a new life in Indiana. Gazing upon the parking garage that sits in the building's place today is as disappointing an experience as a new transplant to South Bend might have felt when he looked upon his new workplace for the first time and noticed, in order, that there were no fountains, the campus didn't actually have a view of the river, and the building wasn't even red. Maybe the employee breathed a bit of a sigh, but then it was time to move on. South Bend was his home now, and the uninspiring factory was his new office. At least he had a job, and it came with good pay. He was about to start his first shift as a master jeweler at the South Bend Watch Company. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we are going to dive into some of the fun and forgotten businesses of South Bend, running the gamut from toys to bait to underwear to newspapers. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, I'd love to dive right into the history of the South Bend Watch Company, but before I can do that, I've got to lay down one little piece of groundwork. In this episode, when I talk about watches, I am always talking about pocket watches, unless I say otherwise. Pocket watches were the fashion and style of the day when the South Bend Watch Company came into business, and so that's what it, and virtually every other serious watchmaker, made at the turn of the century. And at the turn of that century, the two largest American watch manufacturers were the Waltham Watch Company and the Elgin Watch Company. They were two separate and distinct companies, but they operated in the kinds of cooperative ways that the federal government and the Sherman Act weren't supposed to allow. The two companies held joint patents on much of their technologies, and most importantly, they worked together to squeeze all other competitors out of their market. Elgin and Waltham had consolidated the American watch market to such a degree that the newspapers openly referred to the Elgin and Waltham Trust, but through clever lawyering, the companies managed to skirt the letter of the law, even as they openly flaunted its intent. Armed with the highest-paid patent lawyers in the nation, they sued plenty of other watchmakers out of existence. When that strategy didn't work out, they forced jewelry shops into exclusive sales deals. Jewelers who wanted to sell Elgin or Waltham watches were permitted to sell only Elgin and Waltham watches. Jewelers who contracted with any smaller or emerging watchmakers would be blacklisted. Imagine that Nike and Adidas colluded to tell Foot Locker that it couldn't sell any other brands of shoe, and there you are. Rival watchmakers were stymied and crushed in the courtroom and at the marketplace. Elgin and Waltham continued their dominance over the American watch market, and consumer prices remained high, even as modern society drove a literal need for men to own a watch of their own. There was a lot of money to be made, and there were only a few players in the game able to make it. This was the market that the South Bend Watch Company would seek to disrupt in 1902, a company born from the ashes of the wreckage that the Watch Trust had laid in its wake. Our story starts with a Chicago jewelry store owner named Elmer Bassett. Bassett made his early career feasting on the remains of the watchmakers who'd been driven out of business by the Watch Trust. When an upstart watch company closed its doors, Bassett was there to buy out its inventory for a song, then resell those watches during stints in cities across the Midwest. It was a good enough business plan that Bassett was eventually able to invest his earnings into a proper high-end jewelry shop in Chicago. He did good business for a few years, at least until the Watch Trust put two and two together and realized that this was the same fellow who'd crisscrossed the middle part of the country selling all brands of watches for years. Elgin and Waltham blacklisted Bassett, and his business plummeted. Plenty of other jewelers throughout the nation had been in the same situation that Bassett found himself, and plenty of other jewelers had laid down, given up, and quit the business. Elmer Bassett wasn't most jewelers. By May, he was in South Bend, wooing the Studebakers, and helping to make a plan that would overthrow the Watch Trust. Unbelievably, it was going to work. South Bend's business elite rallied around Bassett's bold idea, and they set up an investor group that leads like the roster of some sort of charity all-star contest. Clem Studebaker Jr. was president of the company. Martin Beeger, president of the Mishawaka Woolen Manufacturing Company, was vice president. Irving Sibley of Sibley Machine Tool was another vice president. Other investors included Frederick Fish, who would later go on to become president of Studebaker in 1909, William Reel from South Bend Lathe, Frederick Lazarus, whose son would start Macy's, John Studebaker, George Studebaker, John Studebaker Jr., local builder H.G. Chrisman, Frederick Bidet, president of South Bend Toy Company, Samuel Adler of Max Adler Company, Robert Milton, for whom South Bend's Milton home is named, Frederick Eberhard and James Eberhard Jr., both among the founding family of Mishawaka's Wooling Manufacturing Company, Rudolph and Laura Cam of Mishawaka's Cam Schellinger Brewery, and John Schindler, who owned Mishawaka's 100 Center. That is a lot of people with a lot of money. And if the Watch Trust wanted to take on this new upstart, it was also a group with an awful lot of firepower. There was no confusion about what this new watch company was up against, and it was ready for a fight. All it needed now was a business plan, a factory, some employees, and a name. That last issue was settled first, and the company announced its moniker as the American National Watch Company. You already know that name didn't stick. Then it bought out the carcass of the Columbus Watch Company, a failed and shuttered venture that had once been sued into oblivion by the trust. It built a factory on Mishawaka Avenue on the campus of what is now IUSB and enticed employees to town from across the Rust Belt. It had taken less than a year from conception to grand opening, but on March 23rd, the firm now officially called the South Bend Watch Company was about to launch its operations. We're on to the grand opening, right after the break.
You are invited to Studebaker's spring opening at the Studebaker Repository. Peruse our line of light and heavy, open and top delivery wagons for all purposes. If you're interested in the purchase of a vehicle for business or pleasure, visit salesman Clarence Snoke at the Studebaker Repository at the corner of Lafayette and Bronson Streets. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The South Bend News-Times wrote a lot of great headlines during its run, but it might have saved its best for the grand opening of the factory on Mishawaka Avenue, inaugurating the dawn of the South Bend Watch Company. President Studebaker touches the button that sends an electric thrill through the machinery of the million-dollar watch factory. And what a thrill it was! The factory was modern, large, and state-of-the-art. That electric thrill sent ripples throughout the United States, and it sent shivers down the spines of the executives who ran the Watch Trust. The South Bend Watch Company might have been a new company, but it sure didn't feel like a startup. Its executives were not afraid of the establishment, and they announced it right away when they began hiring talent away from Elgin and Waltham even before the factory opened. It must have stung doubly when the trust learned that Elmer Bassett was the manager of the company. Business took off in a hurry, and watchmakers were working 50 hours a week to satisfy the initial run of orders that came through. All of this was happening even as the construction of the factory was being completed. The last of the windows was being framed, and the last coats of paint were being brushed on. Of course, in the truest expression of a 1900 South Bend business, those final touches had been delayed while workers turned their attention to an even more important project, the company's baseball field. That field was positioned behind the factory, and the newspaper called it the finest baseball field in the county outside of Springbrook Parksfield. It celebrated the opening of that baseball park on August 10, 1903, as South Bend Watch dropped a tilt to the Mishawaka Annex Christian Association by a score of 11-4. The rest of the campaign was not much better. The watchmakers only logged one win that first season. Its lack of prowess on the diamond notwithstanding, the South Bend Watch Company had a pretty great first year, establishing itself as a major player in America's watch market and as a major threat to the established trust. Its second year was even better than the first, and by the start of year 3, Elmer Bassett had departed the company. He returned to Chicago and reopened his jewelry store. It seems Bassett never wanted to be in the watchmaking industry. He just wanted a quality watchmaker that would sell him its products, and now he had one. S.D. Ryder took over as manager of the factory. Operations were smooth, quality control was high. A visitor from the South Bend Tribune remarked on the precision of the company's operations and was impressed at the rigorous tests that watches went through before they were approved for public use. The reporter saw watches baking in ovens, frozen in refrigerators, each test designed to guarantee that a South Bend watch would hold up against anything, and they did. By December, South Bend Watch was as fine a watchmaker as any operation in North America, and now its marketing department was about to catch up. The first marketing coup came in December 1905 when South Bend Watch encased one of its watches for days in a block of clear ice. It placed the block outside of the Frank C. Tepp jewelry store in South Bend, and crowds gathered to gaze into the frigid veneer where they would see a South Bend watch still ticking and keeping perfect time. The ice block traveled to jewelers around the city, attracting crowds and making headlines. By the next spring, the Walter Wellman expedition was ready to make the trek to the North Pole and requested South Bend watches for the trip. Wellman's team never made it to the pole, but the press coverage was thorough in papers across the country, and the mention of those South Bend watches was better publicity than any ad buy. In June 1906, South Bend Watch put on display 2 of its watches that had survived the San Francisco earthquake and fire. Each watch was scorched and dented and damaged, but each watch was still keeping perfect time. South Bend Watch began running ads in newspapers across the country in September, and pictures of a pocket watch frozen in an ice block became synonymous with the company. South Bend Watch even conducted an experiment where letters were left in mailboxes all over the country without an address. Instead, in the place the address should have gone, there was just a sketch of a pocket watch encased in ice. Every single one of those letters made its way back to the South Bend Watch Company. All of it was part of South Bend's industrial renaissance, part of the effort that would make South Bend famous. Never more true than in a story told in the South Bend Tribune in July 1908 about a farmer who seized on the opportunity to buy a South Bend watch because he was already using a Studebaker wagon and an Oliver plow. Clem Studebaker, president of the South Bend Watch Company, began a personal campaign to put a South Bend watch in the pocket of every important man of affairs in the city, and ads ran in the paper that every good South Bender should own a South Bend watch and take extra care to pull it out whenever they were out of town or entertaining out-of-town guests. The marketing worked, and by 1909, South Bend Watch had increased sales every year since inception. It employed 350, and its superintendent, Charles Higginbottom, had become a rock star in the watch world. He would author several niche books about watchmaking and travel a lecture series throughout the country explaining time theory and watchmaking techniques to anyone who wanted to listen to such a thing. The company crossed another milestone in 1910 when it released a new line of watches called Studebakers, the first watches to earn a railroad grade designation. Railroad grade watches were the best of the best, the most durable, most accurate, most readable watches that money could buy. Earning that designation was no small task, and attaching the Studebaker name to the timepieces was a no-brainer. Sales spiked another 20% in 1910, entirely due to the Studebaker Railroad watch line. The Studebaker Railroad line also represented the breaking point for the once unassailable watch trust. Jewelers once bound by Waltham and Elgin's exclusivity contracts were breaking those contracts in droves, enough to force the colluders to bend. Besides that, any attempt to suppress sales of the most precise railroad watches in America could be seen as a threat against national security. It's easy to look at the South Bend Watch Company's gleaming factory, its unbelievable roster of investors, or the nearly 1 million watches that it would sell during its run. But the most impressive thing that South Bend Watch ever did was this. It broke a watch trust that had withstood even the federal government. And now, for South Bend Watch, there was nowhere to go but up. The company's marketing minds came up with another victory in 1915 when they launched the Purple Ribbon campaign. Affixing a purple ribbon to every one of its watches is a kind of brand mark that would stand out in store windows across the country. This, too, was a wild success, and every one of its advertisements came with a new tagline, "Look for the watch with the purple ribbon." It was indubitably better than its previous tagline, "A trip through our factory will interest you." By 1916, employees were working 50 and 55 hours a week just to keep up with orders. When other local factories closed for the week between Christmas and New Year, South Bend Watch remained open, completing orders that were coming in faster than they could be filled. Jewelers in Detroit reported that they sold more South Bend watches than all other makes combined. And then, in 1917, South Bend Watch decided to become the best place in town to work. It began paying generous bonuses, provided life insurance for all of its employees, and planted a garden where employees could take food home with them after work. It unilaterally lowered employees' hours without reducing their pay. In January 1918, when the Wartime Fuel Administration closed non-essential factories across the nation for a few weeks, South Bend Watch announced that its employees would receive full pay anyway. When a blizzard hit South Bend during the closure, South Bend Watch employees alighted on their darkened factory in droves to dig the place out from the heavy snow, their gratitude to a company that had treated them very, very well. South Bend Watch introduced a new model in 1920 called the Wellington, and it should have been the pinnacle of the company's success, and maybe it was, because after the Wellington, it was all downhill after that. And it was going to happen very quickly. We'll get into it right after the break.
Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. Let's go where there are speed, thrills, and spills. It's more exciting than a circus. Come out to Springbrook Park on August 8th, 1920 for professional motorcycle racing with 20 record-breaking daredevil riders. It's the cleanest, fastest sporting event of the season, and it's only at Springbrook Park this Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
In the aftermath of the Great War, the face of the world changed in big and profound ways that still reverberate throughout history. Maps were redrawn, geopolitical alliances were formed, governments were toppled and replaced, powers were shifted, and all of a sudden men wanted to wear wristwatches. That last one doesn't seem like a seismic shift in the way those others do, but for the South Bend Watch Company, it would prove to be the end of the world. In the early 1900s, wristwatches were considered effeminate. They were considered jewelry. Quality watchmakers rarely bothered with wristwatches because, to hear the misogyny of the day tell it, men didn't wear jewelry and women didn't need to tell time. But when men enlisted or were drafted into the service, they were assigned a utilitarian wristwatch as part of their standard set of gear. It didn't take long at all for soldiers to realize that wristwatches were actually quite useful, and certainly less of a hassle than their pocket-borne kin. The stigma around the femininity of wristwatches evaporated when they became the preferred timepieces of war-torn veterans. In a startling instant, the pocket watch was a thing of the past. The South Bend Watch Company didn't believe it would last. Its leaders maintained that wristwatches were a passing fad and decided not to make a wrist-worn version of its own timepieces. It wouldn't be long, they reasoned, before pocket watches reclaimed their rightful place in the American conscience, and when they did, the South Bend Watch Company would be positioned better than its more wistful competitors. They were wrong, of course, but that wasn't the thing that killed the company. Amid declining sales of its pocket watches, South Bend Watch tried something new, a mail-order catalog that would allow them to sell directly to consumers. It launched the Studebaker Mail Order Company, and it started out as a watch catalog, but it exploded from there, growing to carry more than 1,200 products, including golf clubs, screwdrivers, and cookware. If it feels like an old-timey Sears and Roebuck deal, that's because it should. That was the model that Studebaker Mail Order was chasing, and not for bad reasons. Studebaker Mail Order cut out the middleman, ensuring higher margins for the company. It also managed its own credit, meaning the company could make extra money on interest charges over time. Watch sales were down, way down. But with these other revenue streams, the company was still firmly in the black all the way into 1928. It opened a retail store in some of the unused factory space and established something like a department store there. The South Bend Watch Company retail department at 1720 Mishawaka Avenue was boasted in December 1928 as South Bend's Christmas headquarters. It was a direct lift from the Sears and Roebuck playbook. The first Sears store had opened in Chicago just 3 years earlier in 1925. So it wasn't an original idea, but if it works, it works. The company opened 2 more retail stores in spring 1929 in the quiet villages of Highland, Illinois, and Port Gerardo, Missouri. And no, it doesn't make much sense to choose those 2 towns out of all of the cities in America. Either way, it wouldn't matter. The stock market crashed 6 months later, and the Great Depression was on. In the end, it wasn't pocket watches that killed South Bend Watch. It was the credit it had extended on its mail-order products throughout the 1920s. When those customers stopped paying, the company was insolvent in a moment. It couldn't return to its core business of watchmaking, not during the Great Depression, when gold watches were absolutely the kind of luxury purchase that everyone would eliminate. The South Bend Watch Company's factory closed on November 27, 1929, and promised to reopen the next year. South Bend Watch's sales manager, George Neal, gave an interview in the South Bend Tribune on January 1, 1930, in which he said that business was sound and that, quote, "It is difficult to see why anyone should be pessimistic in regard to business conditions in 1930. It might have been the least prescient prediction ever printed." The South Bend Watch Company's factory never reopened. The company went into receivership in January 1932. Its retail store had a going-out-of-business sale in March, and the company's assets were fully liquidated by October 9th. During the next 2 decades, the South Bend Watch Factory would be used as a mattress factory, a rehearsal space for South Bend's Drum and Bugle Corps, a Welch aircraft manufacturing facility, home of the Oriental Wrought Iron Works, and the headquarters of an interest called K-Line Industries. In 1957, the South Bend Watch Factory building burned to the ground, and thousands gathered to watch the old building die. But the building had outlasted plenty, including a watch trust that had once been considered unbreakable. Nearly 1 million South Bend watches were produced, and plenty of them are still around. They're collectible, they're beautiful, and for the most part, they still keep great time. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks again to Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. This was our final episode in the series, exploring some of the forgotten businesses of South Bend, and I hope you've enjoyed it just as much as I have. Our next series will dive into the stars of the South Bend Blue Sox and the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. I hope you'll tune in for those episodes soon. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.